Okay. You stated when you were talking about the doctrine of Tanzi that God is not like creatures, that God's transcendence is not compromised because the Quran is a representation of God's thoughts, which is interesting because I had mentioned the divine ideas. But isn't that kind of the whole issue here? I mean, if the Quran is a created text, it's a representation, that's an icon or an image of divine thoughts. How is that reconcilable with God being not like anything created?
Well, Jay, I've used the analogy with my own thoughts being represented in writing. What I put into writing is not me. That's just an expression of my thought. So if something is analogous like this with God, where God gives us his thoughts in writing, that writing itself is not God. It's only a representation of his thought. I don't understand the philosophy behind it.
So analogy, analogia, is based on some degree of similarity. It may not be univocal or absolutely equated, but it's related to the idea of some notion of similarity. But Surah 42 says that God is in no way like creatures.
That God does not what?
No, in no way like creatures.
Okay, well, that's exactly a point at which I would pick up and say that the real point of that, it says that God is nothing like his creatures, is to not equate anything on earth or that flies in the sky or anything that we know to be creatures with God. God is unique, he's transcendent, and he can communicate with us in the form of the Quran or mentally, but that communication itself is not God. It's just a representation of the thoughts of God. And
So
I
it's
do
an
not see
image.
any
So is it an icon or an image, a symbol?
Well, no, but when you say icon, then I think of images and physical representations.
So the Quran's
which,
not the words of the Quran, and the Quran's not a physical representation of these thoughts of Allah.
If you want to press it that way, then Muslims would say that the same you can say about the Torah. The Torah then too would be a representation of the thoughts of God, and the words of Jesus.
Yeah, but I'm arguing with your theology, not Judaism.
Yeah, in my, I have not, Jay, I have not, and I've confessed this already, I have not studied the philosophy behind this deeply. I know that Muslim scholars have debated these issues, but to me, it is a dead issue. It is a debate that belongs to the Middle Ages and the thought patterns of the Muslim philosophers of that time. I don't see any difficulty saying that the Quran is a representation of the thoughts of God. Or that, more simply put, that it is a divine communication similar to what was given to previous prophets. The Quran
Fair
itself said, we have revealed to you, the Prophet Muhammad, as we have revealed to prophets before you, Noah and others.
Are the thoughts distinct?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Jay.
Are the thoughts in the mind of Allah distinct or not really?
I don't know if I need to make that kind of distinction. Again, Muslim
are there any
philosophers
distinctions
try to make that
Allah?
distinction.
Are there any real distinctions in Allah?
Between the names and between the divine essence? But I don't feel the need to make that distinction. And I don't think that trying to probe that distinction is going to help us to understand why Christians are proclaiming that there is.
Right, because the reason I'm going in that direction is that because the reason that you don't believe in the deity of Christ and the Trinity, ultimately, I would argue, is because of our philosophical assumptions about who God is, what unity is, and to what degree there are distinctions at that higher level or not. So I think it's absolutely a fair question to ask you whether the attributes or the thoughts or whatever are real distinctions or not. I mean, you can ask me all those questions, and you're saying I can't ask you those things.
Well, you can ask, but I don't necessarily have to answer, and my refusal to answer.
Well, I thought you were here to defend the unity of God.
Let me finish that thought. So my refusal to answer would not be a capitulation to accepting the Trinity. Let me point out that our Jewish friends would have presumably the same problem that you are thinking that Muslims should have.
Sure.
And yet our Jewish friends have not seen the necessity to adopt the Trinity doctrine into their religion.
How is that relevant?
Monotheists.
It is relevant.
How is that relevant? Because it shows that Jews who have been abiding by the Old Testament and who would presumably have a similar problem.
Yeah, but you believe the texts were corrupted by the Jews.
But that's a different point, Jay.
No, it's not because so it's arbitrary. It's ad hoc. You pick when you want to take the Jewish stuff and then when you want to reject it. Now you're trying to argue from the Jewish text.
What I'm saying here, Jay, is that if we say that the Quran flowing from the mind of God must somehow be an icon for God, and therefore we would have, in a way, something like two divine persons here,
I didn't make that argument.
Then we would have to say the same thing, even for the theoretical Torah that is
But I didn't make that argument.
So, but Jews would never go that route, and Muslims don't have to go that route. It doesn't matter
what route Jews go, though.
And Jay, Christians did not go that route until first they started to accept Jesus as a divine person, which in its day was a very common thing for people to do, to accept a human being as God. And then they tried to come up with a philosophical justification for having done this. And as part of that justification, they eventually arrived at the doctrine of the Trinity.
So the Jews corrupted the text when you need to look at the text being corrupted by the Jews. But then when you want to refer to the Old Testament as authentic and a genuine revelation of monotheism that you want, that's fine. And then you ask me all these questions about the Trinity. But if I ask the same questions about the Islamic doctrine of essence and attributes, you say I don't have to answer those questions. Well, to me, I think that, you don't have to, you're right, but how are you avoiding the question? By the way, I didn't say that because there are real distinctions that proves that if the Quran in the eternal sense, the eternal Quran is somehow distinct from God, that means that I'm arguing that proves a second person. I believe that the personhood and the distinctions in God are on the basis of revelation. They're not on the basis of speculations. It's what's revealed. And so we take all of these texts as a whole, right? And we look at them and we see what the whole body of these texts revealed. And by the way, the next point I wanted to make was that you're assuming that God can't reveal more and more of himself over time. Your own theology argues that God reveals more and more of himself over time, with the Quran being the final capstone that corrects, the previous mistakes and errors of the religion. So there's no reason why in our system I can't say the same thing. Well, God has chosen to gradually unveil more and more and more of himself. Even the Jews, you want to refer to the Jews, all right, well, even in Jewish religion, they had the notion that Yahweh gradually unveils more and more of himself, right? Isaiah knew way more than Abraham knew. That doesn't mean that there's a contradiction, or because Isaiah doesn't say everything, because Abraham doesn't say everything that Isaiah says, therefore Isaiah can be canceled out because Abraham is who we stick with, right? So there's all these ad hoc assumptions that you have that are not consistent with the presentation of the Quran itself, which I argued that I put out in my first statement. The question there is, where is the Levitical ceremonies? Where is all the stuff in Exodus relating to the priesthood, to the altar? Where is all of that in Islam? How is there continuity, if you want to argue that you have the continuity?
1 minute 30.
Okay, so Jay, now you have shifted the subject to continuity. The question is not whether Islam is
continuous. I can ask you whatever I want in this.
But let me answer your question.
I can shift in this question.
Islam is continuous, and if we ask about discontinuity, Christianity is discontinuous. For example, even talk about the sacrifice.
No, that wasn't my question. My question was where in Islam is the continuity, not where in my position.
You're asking a lot of questions, but
I can ask. This is my interrogation of you. Where in Islam is the continuity?
But interrogation doesn't mean that you answer your own questions.
You're telling
so many questions.
I'll be glad. I already answered you the continuity of where the temple and all that liturgy and all that is in our religion. I'm asking you, where is it in your theology? You can't then turn that around and say that's shifting the blame.
I'm not asking you anything. I'm telling you about this continuity. There is continuity, and you're asking. Am I saying that God cannot reveal more and more of himself? No, quite the contrary. I'm asking you that I'm not asking you now, but my point in my presentation was to say that if God is a Trinity, that should have been known from the very start. This is not one of the things that God would hide about himself.
That's avoiding the very thing.
I didn't. You're not letting me answer, my friend. Okay,
because you're avoiding the question.
Have an equal engagement.